we today? I am Sam, if we haven't met already, and welcome to my greenhouse once again. So today I have some fun things for you. We're going to be talking about propagation. So it's going to be Propagation 101 with Sam. I had this as a poll on my Instagram, which was such a surprise because I had some educational slash plant 101s versus a plant wish list, and a lot of you said plant 101 or educational. Today we're going to be talking about propagation. I'm going to go through with you the very basics to the nitty-gritty tips that I have for you, so no matter where you are on your plant journey, that hopefully you can learn a thing or two. But before I start, I do have to say a quick disclaimer that I'm not a horticulturalist. I do not know much about plants other than like your normal sciencey stuff that I did in my batch in uni. Everything I've done or what has worked for me is all through experience. What I say, take with a grain of salt. Know that everyone's environments and plants are all very different, so what works for me may not work for you or vice versa. Let's start with the basics. What is propagation? Propagation is a method that you can use to pretty much copy or reproduce your plants, but not in like a normal reproductive sexual way. We're talking about you're cutting up your plant so that you can reproduce a copy, an exact copy of your plant. The genetics has not changed. I have a plant and I want to chop it up so that I have two plants. I would personally not chop up this beautiful thing because it is still quite young, but for example, if I were to cut it there and pop it into some sort of media or do a propagation method, that way that I would have two of these plants. So I will be doing a demonstration later on. I've actually filmed this 3 times, and for whatever reason there was no audio, the focus was out, and let's just say that all technical difficulties that could have gone wrong went wrong. But I have cut up one of my plants, which I will show you later on for the demonstration. Let's start off with the essential things that you need for propagation. Scissors, or what I personally prefer is a knife, a very sharp knife. People use secateurs, I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce it. It's pretty much like gardening scissor, but like I said, I personally like knives. That sounds so creepy. Something that is not necessarily essential but is good habit is some rubbing alcohol, and this is pretty much what you use to clean or sterilize your cutting equipment. If I'm being completely honest, I don't actually use rubbing alcohol for all of my plants when I'm cutting them up. I personally just use it for when I have my rarer plants. Of course, you need a vessel or you need somewhere to put the cutting. So things that you can use are like Tupperware containers, which is a great place for humidity. You can use glass, like what I've got here. I'm pretty sure that's a jam jar. I bought this cookie jar from Kmart, which I use for propagating and also keeping my jewel orchids in there. And of course, I do have my little propagation box that I got from Bunnings as well, which I think saves a lot of space, and I would highly recommend. It also has like these little things that you could have a little bit of aeration to. Let's talk about anatomy of a plant because I feel like that's quite important if you're a beginner and you have no idea what I'm talking about. This is the cutting that I was supposed to be demonstrating, and it is a philodendron cream splash. I might mention is that we're talking about a node. So nodes are pretty much the essential vital part of propagation. So a node, or this little spot right here, is pretty much where your leaves are going to grow, where roots are going to develop from. That is really important because if you were to get, so for example, this right here is called an internode. It is in between the nodes. That is a node where you see like a little root and where the leaves come from. You've got a node, another internode, and a node again where more little aerial roots are coming out, and a leaf. So where the leaf kind of develops from and where the aerial roots or the little roots come from, that's the part that you want. If you were to chop up this internode and stick it in dirt, stick it into any material or media or propagation method, it will not produce another plant. You need a node. Let's go through the different types of media that you can use or the different methods of propagation. So we'll first start off with water. What I have here is a few cuttings of my string of hearts in there. I've got the green version and the variegated version, and I pretty much just make sure that the node is exposed into the water and let it sit. The pros of this is that it is so super simple, it is cheap, it is literally just water and a vessel. You pretty much just stick it in and roots will form. One thing that I really love is that you can actually monitor the root development as well, because it's normally in a glass or something clear, so you can keep an eye on it. A con to this is that there are higher risks of root rot. Not to say that it will definitely get root rot, but in my experience, water normally ends up root rotting. Not that I'm a begonia fan, but I know that majority of begonias do really well in water. So I guess it depends on the species, but I know for my chain of hearts, it works quite well. Another con that I find with water is that the transition from water to soil is quite difficult, and the reason for that is that the roots that develop in water are actually water roots. When you pop it into the media or to dirt, it changes the environment and some of them don't actually survive, or the roots kind of die off, which is one of the reasons why I don't personally like water propagating, but it does work a lot for a lot of other people in the world, particularly places that are quite warm. Root rot tends to happen in colder places such as Melbourne right now. Guys, haven't really done anything in the last 3 weeks, but I'm kind of hopeful. Hopefully they just don't rot or die off. But that's the chance you take. If you are propagating with water, that you do have to clean out that water and tip it out and put new water in every so often. I'm quite lazy with it. Everyone says that you should do it every few days. I do it every few months, or when I see that the glass or the vessel is really dirty and brown, that's when I'll clean it out. The next one I'll talk about is perlite. So perlite is a volcanic stone or rock that that is really super duper lightweight. You can get this at Bunnings. It's not cheap, but it's not expensive, so somewhere in between. Pretty much what the perlite does is it uses kind of like the hydroponic system, where you put water at about 1/3 of the container or vessel, and then it wicks its way up and creating a very humid, great environment for roots to form. I haven't really dug deep into perlite just yet, but I do know a lot of people really love perlite. This is probably my first cutting in perlite, and it is doing well. It's got a little bit of roots, and there is no root rot, which is great. I will briefly talk about Hydroton or clay balls. This is a huge bag of clay balls that I got from my friend Vivian, and it's pretty much from her family's business called Pots Galore. So Viv, if you're watching this, thank you so much. I personally don't use Hydroton as much. I bought a really large bag, I would say about a year ago, to try some hydroponics. Didn't really work out, so yeah, I've got lots of Hydroton. But it's really similar to the perlite, which is like you have that wicking action, you put the cutting in. I would say that the clay balls are definitely more on the expensive side, but the great thing about it is that it can be reusable. You can use it for your plants, you can use it for propagation, and it doesn't make a mess, which is one of the things that I wish I could do with all my plants, so that I didn't have to worry about the dirt. The same thing is that if you have it in a container, fill it about 1/3 of the way with water, and you're good to go. My absolute favorite method is Sphagnum. I am a Sphagnum girl through and through when it comes to propagating. I've had really great success with it, probably about over 90%. I don't think I've lost many plants to root rot or anything like that in Sphagnum, but I think it does really depend on how you use it. I've got my little demonstration here. So that is my Sphagnum moss, and it is completely and utterly wet. What I like to do is, if I'm going to use it, I will wring it out so that all the water is gone. So the biggest tip that I have for people that want to use Sphagnum is make sure that it is damp, but it is not wet. That can be a little bit confusing for people that are quite new to propagating, but hopefully I'll have a little tip for you by the end. A pro for me is that once you use your Sphagnum, you can keep reusing your Sphagnum. Every time that I have a cutting or something propagating, once it's all done, I put it back in a container and I reuse it again. It creates such a high humidity environment for your plants, which is great for your roots. And yeah, I really like it. I personally think that there is a learning curve with using Sphagnum, but I feel like once you understand it and you get through that kind of learning process, it works really, really well. So another thing that I'll talk about is a method called air layering. Air layering is something that I personally really love to do with all of my plants if I have the chance to. Essentially, if you've got some Sphagnum moss and you've got a plant, I'll just grab one. So this is a little glorious mama plant that I've literally cut up 4 times. As you can see here, we've got a node with a leaf, and you can see these little dots here, which are the aerial roots that we're going to form, but they've kind of dried out. So what I would do is, for air layering, you would put some Sphagnum moss, wrap it around that node, and you can put some Glad wrap around that and just keep it there, so that the roots would form on the plant while it's still intact. And then when the roots develop, you can cut it after that, which is such a benefit. If you're ever propagating and you cut a plant, it kind of goes into shock. Whereas if you have quite a big root system and you cut it, when you pop it into, either if you're still propagating it into more Sphagnum moss or more media, or straight into dirt, that it has a higher chance of surviving. Whereas if you cut a plant without air layering, it has to focus on the roots. Maybe risky, maybe not, depends on the plant. I think that if you do air layer, that reduces the amount of risk and higher success rate of propagating. One thing that people do is they create moss walls or moss poles. As you can see, I've got my moss walls there, and there's another one back there. So the plants climb up that moss wall with the sphagnum moss. They put their roots into that wall, and so when I feel like chopping it, they already have established roots. That's something that you can do for propagating, is if you don't necessarily want to air layer certain segments of the plant, you can make a wall for it, the plant can climb up, and you can cut as you please. So this, my friends, is my philodendron cream splash, and I've already cut it because, again, like I said, I've filmed this so many times, and I managed to cut this little guy, and that is the mother plant. So what I'm going to do is, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 nodes currently, and I'm just going to cut it into 2 so that we've got 2 leaves there and 1 leaf there. So let's do that. I've got my knife. It has been sterilized. I'm just going to cut. So this is going to be more of the tips kind of way of propagating. Something that I find not a lot of people talk about is the leaf to root ratio in terms of when you're doing cuttings. So for example, if I were to have this whole cutting and trying to make this plant root, the chances of the leaves going yellow and lost is very high because the plant has to sustain these leaves. So when you think about making cuttings, I personally only like to have maybe 2, 3 leaves, just because if you have more than that, the plant has to work a lot harder. So I find that a lot of propagation or plant tips for doing cuttings, that everyone says to cut below the node. So for example, for this cutting, that's the node just there, they would cut just below it. But I actually cut so that you keep the internode intact, just because if this plant were to get rot at the bottom, that you have a little bit of leeway to keep chopping that plant so that it has a higher chance of survival. If you cut really close to the node and that were to rot, then it's kind of a dead plant. If you are ever cutting or you're receiving a cutting, I would personally like to have a cutting with more than 1 node, just so that if one of the nodes were to die, that you still have a chance of propagating that plant. So another thing that you guys are probably wondering, you're like, Sam, why don't you use scissors? The reason why I don't like using scissors and why I like using knives is that it does clean cut. With some scissors, when you cut, it kind of compresses the tissue of the plant, and so that you can have sometimes, like for example, so you can have a plant's tissue, if you can see right there, kind of collapsed and damaged. So that kind of happens when you have blunt scissors. But what an example that I have is when I did my Monstera cutting, that is where I cut, and as you can see, there's not a lot of damage and it's quite clean. So like for surgery, if you were using a blunt knife, the skin that is being cut would be a lot more damaged than if you were using something really sharp. You can minimize damage by using something really sharp, which is why I use a knife. Whenever you're propagating, you want to let the cutting dry. I'm personally not going to put this in sphagnum straight away. I'm going to let that little cut kind of callus over before I put it in a media to reduce, again, the rot. And once that is kind of calloused over, then I will put it into a substrate or a propagation media. I wait maybe a few hours, but if I want to be really sure, I can wait up to 24 hours. Got 2 little cuttings. Something that I get asked quite a lot, especially on my Instagram, is how do I know when my sphagnum moss is too wet and when is it too dry? This is my philodendron brantianum, and one thing that I know when it needs a water or when I know that it's too wet is that if you were to look at the sphagnum moss, you can see that there's a little bit of condensation and cloudiness to the pot. If it's got humidity pockets, that's when you know we're good. If there are no humidity pockets, then it's going to be a little bit too dry, and if it's too wet, then the water will actually stick to the container itself and you can see it. This is one of the reasons why I like using plastic containers for all of my cuttings and propagation, so I can see exactly what's going on in there, so I can monitor the amount of water in the moss. So let's talk about environmental conditions. So tips on making sure that you have high success rate for your plants is that if you have tropical plants, which is majority of the plants that I own, is that you want it to have the best conditions possible. So high humidity, that's why you normally put things in like a little Tupperware container. You want it to be kept warm and you don't want it to be wet for very long. You also want it to have some really decent light. So currently in Melbourne, it is winter, we don't get a lot of light, but anything that the plant can get, like you might want to move certain plants closer to the window. I've just taken off my shade cloth, which is going to immensely help my plants. You just want to optimize those conditions for all of those cuttings so they have the best chance of living. Which goes on to my next point, the best time to propagate anytime during growing season. That's not to say that you can't propagate during winter, because I've got heaps of things propagating in that little tent over there. During winter, propagating is a little bit harder, it's a little bit colder, and things have higher risk of having root rot. Everything just kind of slows down because everything's not getting as much light as growing season. So when it's spring, autumn, and summer, by all means, chop, chop, chop. So I do get questions about, should I fertilize my cuttings? Me personally, I do not fertilize any of my cuttings, just because there is a fine line between doing too much fertilizer for a cutting. So if you were to over fertilize, that plant is going to burn. It's going to have too much nutrients that it can't process, and it pretty much burns and dies out. I don't meddle with fertilizer when I'm doing cuttings unless it has quite a substantial root system already. I do know a few of my friends do microdosing, so they would maybe get a little mister bottle, maybe a drop of their fertilizer, and use that instead, and that seems to work really well for them. I personally haven't done it yet because I'm a little bit of a wuss. Again, to each their own. If you would like to try using fertilizer, go for it, but what I recommend is a very, very minimal dosage. Something that I also really love to use is something called root roids. So hold on, I'll get it. So I got my little packet here because this is the sample that I kind of used from a friend of mine. It's a powder that you mix with water, and it is a microorganism boost for your plants. If you're in Australia, I highly recommend these root roids, and this is by Dr. Green Thumb. All of my propagation things, once they start to have roots, I smash it with this, they literally grow like crazy. So I'll share with you guys another little quick tip that I like to do in summer, and that is if the sphagnum moss is drying out really, really quickly and you find that you have to water every single day, you can actually put Glad wrap just around the top of it and put like a rubber band to keep it all sealed, and I find that that keeps the humidity in a lot better instead of all of the water evaporating out into the air. Another thing that I also really want to talk about is that if you have your plants in like a bucket or a propagating box or a Tupperware container or takeaway container, if it doesn't have holes in it, it doesn't actually get a lot of air circulation, which can lead to mold or yellowing of leaves. Too high of humidity can be a problem. So I actually recommend opening them up at least once a week to air it out. What you can also do is that if you've got like a container, you can poke holes in it just to increase the airflow as well. So I'm going to be a little bit cheeky and put this in a little container for propagating. So I know I said that you're supposed to let the bottoms dry out, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to show you exactly what I do if this were to be already dry anyway. I've got my clear pot because I love my clear pots for propagating, and we chuck a little bit in there. So again, it is just damp, it is not wet. Pop her in there, this one in there too. Make sure that the aerial roots are in the moss itself, and bada bing, bada boom. Instead of one plant, my friend, now I have 3. I only really started propagating maybe a year ago, but only went to town just recently because my friends Haley and Jake have showed me that propagating is like the best way to increase the amount of plants that you have, and honestly I'm obsessed. So if you guys are like me and there's a little bit of doubt and a little bit of scares, what if I kill this plant? Start off with your plants that if it were to die, it's not a really big deal. I would keep all of the rarer ones on hold for the first few to kind of build your confidence, learn about how propagating works, and then work your way up to more of your rare plants and multiply them as much as you can. Trust me when I say that propagating is so much fun. It's also really rewarding for going from something really small to something like an established plant. So that pretty much wraps up this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope that you've learned a thing or two. If you do something a little bit different that you have found is really great for propagation or has increased your success, please share it with us down below. So I'll catch you guys in the greenhouse in my next video. Bye! Mwah!